Good evening, everyone. I'm Bruce Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and with me here is Trish Hennessy. Trish is our Director of Strategic Issues, and she's the person who organized all of this wonderful event, along with Craig Pickthorne. And first of all, this is our second David Lewis lecture, and we'd like to welcome you all, for those who were at the first one and for those who are just coming to the second one. And we'd also like to thank Trinity St. Paul's Center for Faith, Justice, and the Arts for co-sponsoring this event so we could host it in such a beautiful venue. And I want to encourage you to stop by their welcome table at the entrance, and they would like you to know that they're looking for partners to co-sponsor democracy events. So, stop by the welcome table and they can elaborate. I should also tell you that tonight's event happens to be the hottest ticket in town. It's sold out. So if I think it looks like you've all got seats and you haven't had to cozy up too close to your neighbor. But we assure you that the evening will be well worth it. Trish.
So before Michele and Stephen take to the stage, I want to talk briefly about the man in whose name this lecture series is in honor of, Stephen Lewis's father, David Lewis. I never met David Lewis. I understand that when he came to Canada, he didn't know English very well, and decided that he would learn English by reading Charles Dickens. It's one way to do it. As someone who I grew up and I had this very morbid fascination with Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy, both depressing storytellers. So I figure anyone who decides to learn English through Dickens is okay in my books. And I'm not sure if it was the influence of Dickens or the influence of his father, who had been a leader in the Jewish labor bund, but David Lewis went on to live a life in dedication of and completely committed to the cause of greater equality. Ultimately he became the leader of the federal NDP in its early days. And through that, he pursued the notion of greater equality through the portal of parliamentary democracy, democratic socialism, where he saw an active role for government to mitigate the damaging effects of capitalism through stronger government regulation, for instance. Probably the kind of government regulations that could have prevented the 2008 global economic meltdown. I would be very curious to know what he would think about the Occupy movement that began in Wall Street and has now spilled over across the US and into Canada. David Lewis, the man who popularized the notion of corporate welfare bums. Now we, in this era where the Occupy movement is shining new light on government for the 99%, we the 99%, shedding new light on the excesses of corporate rule. We shared in common a love for Dickens, and also in my own work, I'm very committed to greater equality. I work with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Growing Gap team, Armin Yanlizian, and Hugh McKenzie, who is in the audience tonight. And Hugh McKenzie actually deserves credit for coming up with the idea of this lecture series in honor of David Lewis. It's just one of about 1,000 good ideas Hugh McKenzie has come up with in his lifetime. So with that, I will pass it over to Bruce so that you can tell us a little bit about Michele and Stephen.
I will. Stephen Lewis, as you know, has been a fighter for democratic socialism for his life in the same way that David Lewis did in his time. You know of his work with the United Nations that broke new ground for HIV/AIDS in Africa, and that he continues this work through the Stephen Lewis Foundation. He's the co-founder and the co-director of AIDS-Free World in the United States, and he's currently distinguished visiting professor at Ryerson University, where he's inspiring a whole new generation of students. When the second wave of feminism was in its nascency in Canada, Michele Landsberg established herself as a strong and original voice for women. Her writing on feminism and social justice has spanned several decades, during which time she has been a fearless advocate for women and children. Michele uses words to fight injustice, to attack oppressive power structures and policies, to champion the cause of human rights, race and gender equality, peace, and pluralism. Through her Toronto Star columns, she gave a strong public voice to many of those who would have had no voice. Many of those columns are now bound in her new book, Writing the Revolution, which is hot off the press and which will be available for sale and for book signing in the gymnasium behind us after her conversation with Stephen tonight. Both Michele and Stephen have been strong supporters of the CCPA, as have all members of the Lewis family. And it's a privilege for us to be hosting this event tonight, not only because of who their father and grandfather was, but also as a thank you for all their support they have given us and for their role in building the movement for social justice, as did David Lewis before them. I now give you this year's David Lewis Lecture guests, Michele Landsberg and Stephen Lewis.
Both Michele and I find it difficult when facing a hostile audience. I want to add a word to the plaudits that were conferred on Hugh Mackenzie, a good friend. I want to tell all of you how privileged the CCPA is to have him, because in my experience, we worked together for several years in the 1970s. He's one of the most brilliant researchers I have ever encountered, and he puts the sword to the chest of capitalism in a way which is entirely delicious. You will know that Avi and Naomi were the lecturers last year. Avi Lewis and Naomi Klein, and Michele and I are doing it this year. And as Avi said at Michelle's book launch, Ilana Landsberg Lewis and Jenny Lewis will do it next year. And then the grandsons are slotted for the fourth. So there is a gentle touch of nepotism to this process. I want to introduce those in the family who are here. I see my brother, Michael Lewis, just over here. Michael, do you want to stand? David Lewis's daughter, one of his two daughters, the twin daughters, the other is not here, and that's Janet Solberg, who is right there. Who brings the Stephen Lewis Foundation colleagues along as a cheering section on a regular basis. And I want to recognize Ilana, who I believe is in the audience, because we've already said hello. Where are you, Lan? And And with Ilana are David's great-grandchildren, Zev and Yoav. You want to stand, fellas? You're next in line. All right, I think I've somewhat overdone it, but I rarely get an opportunity like this. We were both salivating with the prospect of unleashing these familial antecedents on you. I want to add to what Trish said, if I may, to get things off. David's father, Mesha, was a Menshevik and Bundist in the early days of the 20th century, having been born in the little town of Swisloch on the Polish-Russian border, and having been subject during the Leninist post-revolution period to imprisonment and a considerable threat. And Michele was reminding me that David, as a young boy, grew up with the sounds of gunfire reverberating nearby as the Germans and the Poles and the Russians back and forth crossed the border during the First World War, and there was a tremendous sense of peril and an ominous sense of death that surrounded all of it. They left the Soviet Union-Polish border. Mesha Lewis, my grandfather, was a denizen of the democratic left and immersed himself in the Bundist movement, the Arbeiterring, the workman's circle, which embraced the values of democratic socialism. So my father's espousal of these elements of social justice very much flowed from this inheritance. They arrived in Canada around 1921. And it's true, David learned English by reading the Old Curiosity Shop. And he went through elementary school and secondary school in 4 years, having come knowing not a word of English when he arrived. I find that deeply offensive. But I have learned to cope with it, as sons do. He was 12 years old. He went to Baron Byng High School in Montreal, which was notable for people like Abe Klein and Irving Layton, and he went on to McGill, where he won a Rhodes Scholarship, and with that Rhodes ended up at Lincoln College in Oxford, where he became the first ever Canadian who led the Oxford Debating Union, which was a phenomenal achievement. And I think it's fair to say, looking back at the literature of the day, that he was probably, if not the most formidable debater and speaker that Oxford had ever experienced, certainly one of them, and played a very significant role. Mentioning McGill allows me a brief addendum. One of the things which McGill never did for someone who brought enormous honor upon them was to give David Lewis an honorary degree. He was always vetoed in the Board of Governors of the University of McGill, either on the grounds that he was a socialist or that he was a Jew. But in one case or the other, it was always denied him. You can't imagine the pleasure it gave me when I got an honorary degree at McGill to accept it in the name of my father and tell them what bastards I thought they were. In the course of his Rhodes days in the United Kingdom at Oxford, David was a deep anti-communist, inheriting the views of his father, who had been a Menshevik rather than a Bolshevik, who believed in social democracy rather than communism. And that dimension of David's life, which is not often talked of, his anti-communist ethos, permeated much of the work he did over the subsequent decades. He was offered a seat by the British Labour Party in the 1930s. He was offered and promised a cabinet post in the first Labour government that might subsequently be formed, which occurred immediately after the Second World War. There were people like Sir Stafford Cripps who thought that David would one day be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He turned it all down to come back to Canada to help develop the then CCF. the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. And he devoted from 1935 to 1950 in the tremendous battle over the consolidation of socialism in Canada. In the course of it, he lost 4 election campaigns personally in the 1940s. This trial by fire is endemic to people of the left. Most lose many times before they're finally elected. But in a most tenacious and indefatigable way, David worked on the building of the party and was in every sense the intellectual architect of social democracy in Canada in those years. You make occasional enemies when that happened, and there weren't, not everyone embraced David with love and affection, but he was the centerpiece of the party's activities. And of course, along the way in 1935, when he got to Canada, he married Sophie Carson, our mom, and then later in the 1950s, he became a labor lawyer, worked for the United Steelworkers, managed to overcome the control of the mine mill union in Sudbury, which was in the hands of the communists. David spent a lot of time attacking the communists. And in the 50s, Michele warned me not to be too excruciatingly particular about dates, so I'll let you go to Wikipedia yourselves when this is over. But in the 50s, David was the intellectual architect of the Winnipeg Declaration, which refashioned the famous Regina Manifesto from the 1930s, and it moved the manifesto from a document which was extremely radical, calling for the eradication of capitalism. I don't know why that's radical, since it's so much warranted.
Doing it by itself.
And you're quite right. Michele says it's doing it by itself, and more power to it. And also got rid of those clauses which were so insensately incendiary around nationalizing virtually everything in sight. And that worried people, so the Declaration became a modified expression of social democracy. However, it did not save the CCF. CCF was virtually obliterated in the Diefenbaker sweep in 1958. I can remember being a very young fellow and hearing a phone conversation on the extension with my dad and Stanley Knowles actually crying on the phone and saying, "David, what do I do now? Parliament has been my whole life." And David saying, "Don't worry, Stanley, we'll create something new." And that's exactly what happened. They created collectively, with the labor movement, with farmers' cooperatives, with a lot of independent thinking, progressive people, the New Democratic Party in the 1960s. And very briefly, it was created in 61. David Lewis was elected to Parliament in 1962, and except for one brief interregnum of perverse idiocy on the part of the numbskull voters of York South, he served in a continuum from I'm completely out of control. I was speaking to the CUPE National Convention in Vancouver a couple of days ago, and I was telling them, in about 9 or 10 days' time, I'm going to be 74. I'm in my dotage. I don't give a tinker's damn what anybody thinks of me. So David began his political career in 1962. I can remember Jerry Kaplan, very, very close friend and tremendous partisan and artisan in the Democratic left. Jerry and I managed that campaign together. And there then evolved a number of significant moments in David's life. He was in the House of Commons in 1970 when Pierre Trudeau introduced the War Measures Act in October, and he and Tommy stood shoulder to shoulder so bravely against this extraordinary encroachment on civil liberties and human rights. In 1971, he ran for the leadership of the party after Tommy stepped down. It was a very tough contest. It went 4 ballots. He defeated James Laxer, who was representing what was called the Waffle, a kind of internal breakaway group. James, as most people know, was an extraordinarily gifted and talented fellow, remains so to this day. David emerged as the leader of the party in 1971, and in 1972 fought the most brilliant campaign of his life, when he coined the phrase corporate welfare bums. Day after day, he would take another corporation, multinational corporation, and describe the tax benefits, the subsidies, the absence of corporate taxes they were paying, and the country was electrified, and it reduced Pierre Trudeau to a minority government, and in that minority government, David promised support if Trudeau would do a number of things, amongst which was to create Petrocan, which was then a Canadian-owned resource corporation, and that gave everybody immense satisfaction. For me, those were spectacular years. I was the leader of the party in Ontario. My dad was leader of the party federally. We had always had a good father-son friendship, but in the 70s, it became very intimate and intense, and I sought his counsel virtually every single day on every issue, and you can imagine how privileged I felt to have it. David was a man who was consumed by the quest for social justice. It reverberated through every part of his persona. It meant everything to him. He saw it through democratic socialism. He did not withdraw an inch in the face of provocation or despair. And it's a wonderful context within which to hold this conversation, because it sets a kind of background, an inheritance within which others of us can continue the good fight, which was what David called his autobiography. Alas, only one volume. He never got to write the second. He died in 1981 at the age of 71, 72. He had spent some time after politics teaching at Carleton, but after a long and difficult fight with cancer, he died. And his contribution, I think, is extraordinary and unassailable in its integrity. And if I may say, as a son, and Michele shares this with me, I know, it's often confused me on occasion and surprised me on occasion when commentators, both in media and in print, going through the legendary background of NDP leaders, say there was Tommy Douglas and then there was Ed Broadbent. And somehow the fixture in the center, who was the intellectual artisan of socialism and the constant animator of democratic socialist principles, gets lost in the shuffle. So I'm glad that the CCPA has rescued us collectively from that inheritance. In the context of David's quest for social justice, Michele, who has written the #1 bestseller on the New York Times, Writing the Revolution, wants to start us off with feminism. Sweetie.
Yes, though David himself was certainly no feminist.
I was worried about this evening.
Well, don't get me wrong, I admired him tremendously and I revered him before I even knew him. The first time I heard him speak, he was debating William F. Buckley at Hart House. Must have been around 1960 when I was a university student, and Buckley, that serpentine individual, was winning this huge student audience over with his snaky rhetoric and elitist gestures and so on. And at one point, he made the dire mistake. He seemed to be winning the debate, which was going to be by audience vote. He made the dire mistake of making a slighting reference to working people. And David, suddenly it was like Superman, leaped into the fray with just blazing outrage and evoked the poor man working hard for a living and being out on a picket line and walking back and forth with nothing to shelter him from the cold but a tattered raincoat. I can still see the raincoat. And the audience just roared its approval, and David won the debate handily. But it was that passion for social justice and equality that I really revered. And after I met him, after going out with Stephen, I remember very vividly being impressed. One night, David had lost the election, and I said, "How can you bear it, David? This unworthy person is going to Parliament and you're not." And he said, "Oh, my victory or loss doesn't mean anything. It maybe won't happen in my lifetime, but it will happen." And he was completely convinced in the long run, and put his own trials in a longer perspective, which I greatly admired and have struggled to attain myself over the years, but unsuccessfully. I want justice now, but in the light of Stephen evoking our nepotism and our family links, I just was reminded of how, when I was pregnant the first time, other women who are more normal in their views lie awake worrying about maybe something wrong with the baby-to-be. I would lie awake until finally I would wake Stephen up and say, "What if it grows up to be a Liberal or a Tory?" And I was totally genuine about this, and I said, "I won't be able to love it." But then I wasn't yet a mother. I'm happy to say that no such drastic thing happened. It's quite all right, and I can love them all very freely. But as I mentioned, David was not particularly a feminist, and the party has an interesting and checkered history in this line. Of course, I was drawn to the party because of left-wing beliefs, but I could never delude myself that it was a champion for women, because although the party earnestly tried to get more women voters and proudly had the first woman in Parliament, Agnes MacPhail, she was no feminist either, by the way, they really never applied a feminist analysis to any issue, any more than the other parties did. It took a very long and difficult time before the party stopped seeing feminists as a splinter group that might distract the party from the really important issues. Nowadays, we all see them as completely entwined. You know, progressive politics and feminist politics seem inseparable, but even as a young woman, after we were married and had kids, the party was still saying, "Oh, the feminists might disrupt the annual general meeting or the convention." You know, they were worried about it. And Blakeney and Romano in Saskatchewan were enemies of feminism. They came up with the Kitchen Constitution, which excluded women from the Charter of Rights. Blakeney was adamantly opposed to public childcare. Romano was anti-choice. So the party and Saskatchewan, our proud home of Medicare and of Tommy, one expected better. But changes did come slowly.
Even in your husband.
No, the reason I married you was because you were already egalitarian. First egalitarian man I ever met. That was 1962, and even my boyfriends really didn't get it. I had to train them and force them to read Simone de Beauvoir, which they highly resented. But I instantly saw that Stephen really was egalitarian and didn't have any ridiculous views about the inferiority of women, and women were people to him as there was just no difference in his mind between the rights and personhood of men and women. So that's why I married him 6 weeks after I met him. I figured I'll never meet another one of these. And he talked me into it, I should say. I was opposed to marriage as a good feminist. Of course, I didn't have the movement with me. There was no movement. There wasn't a movement until long afterwards. So I was very lonely in my feminism and had no one to talk to about it. But it was very exciting when the movement did come along. And I was highly privileged to fall into a job at the Toronto Star. It was already 1978. Of course, the women's movement didn't get off the ground until the late 60s. It didn't happen in the early 60s. And there I was when so much change and ferment and exciting dynamics were at play in society. The whole world was revolutionized by feminism. It's a huge revolution. It's like how they say about boiling a lobster, it happens slowly, so they don't know. People don't realize how immense this was, and unless you're old as I am and can remember, in high school, my guidance counselor was appalled at the idea that I wanted to go to university. As far as he was concerned, the only appropriate thing was to be a teacher or a nurse. And he tried to persuade me to go to what we then called normal school. That's what teachers' college was called. And in university, it was the same. There were no women professors at University of Toronto in my course, and there was absolutely no respect for women's intellect. We were inferior. No women authors were studied. And we all absorbed this without complaint because there was no movement to tell us it was wrong. And if we secretly suspected it was wrong and biased, we kept it to ourselves because we didn't want the mockery and negative and the hostility that we might bring down on ourselves. So the movement was long in coming. And when it came, it exploded and completely changed everything. And those were very exciting times for me, which I revisited when I started preparing the book, which has just come out, because I was going back over 3,000 columns. I admit that I fell asleep over them very often. There were just so damn many of them. But at the same time, all the key subjects that roiled up society were there. The fight over reproductive choice, the fight over the Dalcon shield, all the health risks that women were exposed to because nobody gave a damn, including our government. And the health and safety people in Ottawa laughed at me when I said, why are condoms tested, but tampons aren't? Tampons were causing toxic shock deaths at the time, and they weren't tested, and no one knew what the contents of the tampons were. And the head of the medical devices branch said to me, why would we test tampons? I said, will you test condoms rigorously? He said, yes, because they protect men's health. So people kept giving me lines like that, just wonderful. So it was a time of enormous change, and women were so ready to hear this message. The letters came pouring in. It was fantastic. 100, 200 letters a week. I would spend hours cutting open envelopes and reading the letter. No email. Anyone here old enough to remember mail? And they were ecstatic that I was tackling these subjects. And the readers taught me a lot. There was so much I didn't know about what was happening to women. I remember a sexual harassment case that took place in the Canadian military. A woman had been brutally sexually assaulted by her boss. She was a cleaner in a barracks up north somewhere. And when she complained and took her case, finally, after several years of terrible abuse, she took her case to the authorities. They fired her. And But she didn't stop there. She went farther, and finally she wrote to me, and I wrote the column, and eventually she got redress. It was a breakthrough case, and there were so many of those because nobody had ever treated women's situation seriously before. It was extraordinary privilege to be the one to write about all these things. Incest was a subject that everyone recoiled from and nobody ever spoke about, and I didn't want to either. The first time a book appeared by an incest victim, I can't remember the name of it, but the author was an American woman, and her publicist couldn't get anyone in Toronto to review the book or even mention it. So finally, and I didn't want to either, incest, I didn't want to. Finally, out of guilt, I agreed I would go meet this woman, and it was fantastically enlightening. The book was very powerful, and it was a breakthrough moment for me because I got over my aversion to this difficult subject and realized I'd known for a long time how widespread it was, but I'd never really wanted to confront it directly. So all these subjects came up, the abortion issue, got myself into lots of trouble with that one. But anyone here remember Joe Borowski? That lunatic. He had a health food store out west. I guess it was Manitoba or Saskatchewan, and he was a complete nutcase. But he was allowed to pursue women's right to abortions, to attack and take it through every level of the justice system, right up to the Supreme Court. And in his final appearance at the Supreme Court, women were not allowed to be present or to they were allowed to be present in the courtroom. They were not allowed to present any briefs or make any argument to the court on the grounds that they would be biased. Yeah, and this was the early 1980s. So it was a long, long time before we got the right to control our own destinies by controlling our reproduction. And that was a key and staggeringly wonderful moment when that happened in '88. So we have to... We have to fight to keep that right now because everything we won and achieved is in danger of being rolled back. All the infrastructure that the feminist movement built up, the national organizations in law and justice in every way, have been dismantled, first by the Martin government and now by Harper. So we have very few protections now with a conservative majority, and I think all of us are frightened about what they'll do. The Long Gun Registry, founded after the Montreal Massacre by survivor of the massacre, is now endangered and about to expire. I have no idea why it's such a threat to gun owners to have to list their guns. Why is that so terrifying to them? But we're losing that protection among many others, and therefore, I'm very happy to say, this is sort of a Marxist pache, David, but a Marxist kind of interpretation, the worse it gets, the better for feminism, because women are stirring, they are rising up again, especially young women. And I see all sorts of young women's websites, blogs. The communication is tremendous and rich and interesting and filled with controversy and liveliness, and organizations are coming to life all across the country. So I have great hopes for another surge in feminist achievement. And I wanted to mention your feminism too, Stephen.
You mean the AIDS stuff?
Yes, Stephen was, as I said, egalitarian from the beginning, and at the UN made some wonderful speeches on women's behalf. And then really caught fire when he witnessed firsthand the AIDS epidemic and how deeply misogyny and the deprivation of rights of women played into and indeed created and fostered that epidemic. And then Stephen had the outrage and desperate longing for justice that I had had at the very beginning of the movement. You know, when he talked to me about the injustice done to women in Africa, he would grind his teeth with rage, and I would remember how I had felt in the early days. So,
You see, over the years, I've managed to achieve a certain legitimacy in this realm. But it's entirely true. It is, in fact, terribly painful for a family of socialists who are committed to multilateralism to see the way in which the United Nations failed to respond to the pandemic and the desperate toll that was taken over the years, the incredible carnage largely visited on women because of the inadequacy of the response. It drove me crazy. It drives me crazy to this day. And there were so many things about it which were out of kilter. You know, in the Millennium Development Goals, which were brought into place in the year 2000, incredibly enough, in the 8 goals, there was not the slightest mention of sexual and reproductive health. No one in the massive arena of male hegemony felt that sexual and reproductive health was a legitimate matter for people to see as a goal to be achieved by the year 2015. And similarly, when they looked at the achievement of gender equality, they defined gender equality. This staggers me to this day. They defined gender equality as the number of girls in school. That was the entire definition of equality. They could not see anything in the vast panoply of discrimination visited upon women in so many areas of violations of human rights. So the pandemic of HIV and AIDS was but an extension of the misogyny to which Michele refers. And when you look at it even today, when, and this will be known to most in this audience, I suspect, even today, of the 23 million people carrying the virus on the continent of Africa, over 60% are women. And in the most vulnerable age range of 15 to 24, where virtually half the new infections occur, something between 72 and 78% are young women and girls. And that reflects the absence of sexual autonomy. It reflects the concurrent partnerships which some women have, but many, many men have. And it reflects the intense vulnerability to the virus. Indeed, even in the one area which should have been the easiest preventive intervention in the world, which is to prevent the transmission of the virus from mother to child during the birthing, during pregnancy and delivery and infant feeding afterwards, even there, the entire focus for the last 10 years has been on producing an HIV-negative child, and it's only now, literally, in the last 18 to 24 months, that we've begun to look seriously at what is happening to the mother. Are they getting tested? Do they get antiretroviral drugs during the course of their pregnancy? Does anybody care about the infant feeding afterwards? Because we now know that exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months, accompanied by antiretroviral drugs, will prevent the mother from becoming, will prevent the child from becoming infected in that period of time, no transmission through breast milk, and that the mother will be secure thereafter if the treatment continues. It's been such a struggle to deal around women, and the place internationally where it is now most starkly felt is without question around sexual violence. It sometimes feels as though there is a contagion sweeping the world, and God knows how we're going eventually to deal with it. But I've spent a lot of time laterally in the Congo, where the sexual violence as a result of conflict is a nightmare. In Kenya, where the post-election sexual violence was horrendous. In Zimbabwe, where in the elections in 2008, Mugabe unleashed his Youth Corps and his war veterans to rape women solely and exclusively because they were orchestrating, organizing, or voting for the opposition party, and the rape camps are in place again as they move towards an election next year. And so many of my colleagues and others are working frantically to deal with this situation. The foundation, I'm very proud of them, proud of Ilana and what she has created with her colleagues. They've got an institute on the prevention of sexual violence. The whole Grandmothers to Grandmothers campaign in the foundation is again built on the premise of what happens to women, in this case, older women who are utterly neglected by the international community, even though they look after the orphans who are left behind when their parents die. So it's such a continuing struggle. But the sexual violence part of it is the part that drives you nuts, because of course raping and gang raping, to which so many millions of women are subject, results so often in transmission of the virus in conflict situations in particular, and in societies where there's not conflict, but whereas in South Africa the rape levels are so high. And you have to do something about the sexual violence in order to deal with the virus. We'll never contain the virus until we deal with the sexual violence. And even though there are endless Security Council resolutions and huge numbers of peacekeepers in a place like the Congo and a dozen international agencies ostensibly united in countering and protecting the women from sexual violence, we've just never been able to put it to an end. And believe me, as I sit here, it's because it's women. I remember attending the opening in February of something called the Village of Joy, which the foundation supports in the regional capital of Bukavu in the eastern region of the Congo. It was a little city, as it's called, really 100 homes, built largely by the women themselves, who are surgically repaired. Their internal organs are surgically repaired by the doctors at the hospital, the Panzi Hospital, and then they will recover at these 100 homes. And every 6 months, there'll be a new group of women, and they will learn a trade, and they'll go back into the community, and they'll have the strength of numbers and the extraordinary resilience and courage that they show. And when it was opened in February, 3,000 women came together. Every single one of them had been raped. Every one of them. It was an astonishing gathering. It was largely the brainchild of Eve Ensler, the remarkable woman who wrote the Vagina Monologues and who has the NGO V-Day. And I remember half a dozen of the women took a microphone and spoke to the crowd. They were incredibly eloquent and passionate. And one of them, a very young woman in her early 20s, looked down at the governor of the region who was there with all his satraps and sycophants. And she said to him with a feeling that cannot be communicated, "You know why this is happening, Mr. Governor. You know that if this were happening to men, we would have resolved it 20 years ago, but it's because it's happening to women." And the entire crowd erupted. And you knew that a moment of truth had been expressed. And it is galling. It's incredibly galling. I couldn't get over the last several years I've spent watching the carnage amongst women in this pandemic of AIDS. And the one thing that's happened, which is so exciting, so thrilling that I was levitating when it occurred, was the creation of the new international agency for women called UN Women that came into place in February of this year. It was the original brainchild of my co-director in the organization I work with in the United States, and everybody said it wasn't possible, but by God, we worked at it, many others worked at it, and a surprising thing happened. It was recommended by a high-level panel, and then the countries got together and they decided they wanted it, and then we found the leader for it. That was the real question. Who would lead it? And it turned out, and she made herself available after much importuning and begging, it was Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile, a feminist socialist. I mean, you would think there would have been a massive cardiac arrest in the United Nations constituency. But she's so formidable, so charismatic, so incredibly influential that one gets a sense that maybe we've finally put into place, if we can get $1 billion a year into their hands by the end of next year, a women's agency that will give support to the little enclaves of women in countries who've never had resources or voice before. This business of voice, the way in which the world is beginning to rebel, this feeling that capitalism is completely off the rails, that inequality is wrenching, that the 1% have gone berserk at the expense of the 99, this that's happening now is actually exhilarating. And in a segue that I've worked on for some years now, I'm going to suggest that Michele talk about the occupancy movement.
Well, that's completely suitable because I think you were a little more skeptical at the beginning, and then I had the opportunity, being in New York, to go down and visit Occupy Wall Street. And I found this a completely thrilling experience. Here were so many diverse people of every race, every age group, working in total cooperation, horizontally, as they put it, no leadership, and everything achieved by consensus with painful slowness. The most moving thing was to watch the human microphone, where because they were, the authorities tried to squash them in every possible way, so they banned any amplification in Zuccotti Park, where they're camped out. So in order to have a mass meeting, they had to find a way without microphones or megaphones. They invented the human microphone. The speaker would speak one sentence slowly, and then the first 10 rows of listeners would repeat it word for word so that the people behind could hear it, and they repeated it, and the people behind would hear it. And to hear the listeners so engaged and repeating every sentence and making it their own without technology to assist them, it was beautiful. And I loved the people there and the way they were working, and I sensed the affiliation with the techniques that the women's movement had pioneered, of no leader taking over and making decisions by consensus. It was very stirring to see this happen, and they're fighting for the same thing we fought for: equality and an end to injustice. And I thought it was so despicable of the smug media saying, right-wing media, and they're all right-wing, saying, oh, well, they have no proper demands. Yeah, someone made a joke out of it saying, yeah, they have no proper demands, so we can ignore them. Yeah, they have a demand, all right, an end to this inequality and hopelessness that the capitalist system has foisted on all of North America and elsewhere. And this movement is springing up in many, many countries simultaneously. And I think they're so wise not to make a list of demands. Their time, and by their own way of being, by the life they're living in those encampments, show the kind of society they want. This is almost Quaker, isn't it? Yeah. And they're bearing witness to a better way of living, working, and deciding. And it's generous and disciplined and humane. And I think I've been politically despairing for a long, long time. Of course, one never gives up, but I didn't see any sign of hope on the horizon. People seemed so apathetic, dormant, in fact, to all the injustices happening. And to see young people springing up and saying, no, this is not the way our society should be, that gives me hope that things can change and will change. I'm sure that this movement is highly significant. And I was on CBC's program Q the other day, and Gian Gomeshi, the host, quoted to me what Margaret Wente had said the week before, that that the movement was unimportant and you could safely ignore it. It will just go away. It's meaningless. And I laughed because nothing could be farther from the truth. For little bands of people without power or money or access to media or anything else to have occupied the front pages, to have changed the conversation at the highest levels, where presidents and bankers have to talk about equality. Unbelievable. What an achievement. So, I don't know what David would have thought about the Occupy movement, but I love it, and I see great hope for all of us, and hope they'll remain steadfast, and that everybody here will take a chance to go down. Occupy Toronto is very different from Occupy Wall Street. There are a lot more homeless people staying with them, street people, and that's just fine. Every city should reflect what its most immediate problems are. And I think if you go down there and spend a little time, take some food, whatever is convenient for you, you'll be very moved, as I was.
Let me add, if I may, just an addendum to that, and then perhaps we can engage in a Q&A.
Yeah.
Actually, Michele didn't tell you, but she went down to the Toronto Occupy Toronto, and spoke one of the Saturdays ago. And there, I mean, that's when the ground trembled, and but it was a wonderful exchange. We're in the middle. The New Democratic Party is in the middle of a leadership contest now. There are 8 candidates. There may be 1 or 2 more. Everybody trying so hard, I think, to capture the spirit of Jack Layton and the extraordinary sense of generosity and decency which he conveyed politically. It's not easy.
Stephen, I just have to interrupt.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
But, you know, I was going to say when I talked about feminism in the party that Jack was really the very first leader who embodied a deep acceptance of feminist beliefs. He started the White Ribbon campaign years before it was fashionable to stand up against violence against women. And his partnership with Olivia was an exemplar for everyone, his complete decency around women's issues. So I think that shouldn't go unsaid at this moment.
Thank you. And I obviously agree, and it is just part of his whole gestalt. It was what made Jack Jack, and what he left to the party. But I just wanted to say why the Occupy movement is so important, and why what's happening in the aftermath of Jack is so important. We have a government in place at the moment that has an agenda that is not hidden. It's entirely explicit. We have a Prime Minister in Stephen Harper who, in action after action, whether it's getting rid of the long gun registry, or destroying the wheat board in the West, or paying no attention to jobs and human insecurity,
Gunning for the CBC.
who wants to go after the CBC, who's bringing in one piece of malevolent legislation after another against trade unions. We have a Prime Minister whose objective is to change the values and culture of Canadian society. And this requires a tremendous battling response. I mean, if ever there was a rationale for democratic socialism, it's at this moment in time, because we're facing a government that genuinely believes, and I'm sure this is discussed around the cabinet table, that if they can get a re-elected majority, if they can be in power for 8 years, we will not recognize the Canada that exists in 2020. And somehow we have to put a stop to that. I mean, this is a tremendous political battle. It has to end. I'm not romantic about Canada. I think it's a wonderful country in so many respects, and deserves the best that it can bring. But what we're seeing is an erosion of values, a kind of ideological idée fixe that is so inflexible it doesn't care about the damage that is done to those who are most vulnerable and marginalized. Not even the assaults on women are, in terms of the legislation and the disruption of women's groups, the way in which all of the NGOs who service the human condition are being displaced and dismissed. It's a very, very difficult moment in time, and it's a moment when the democratic left has to come together, when, if I may say, the work of the CCPA is absolutely indispensable in setting out chapter and verse. So grit your teeth and go after these Neanderthals and Philistines, and make sure over the course of the next 4 years that the values which are so important and intrinsic to the Canada we know are not distorted, subverted, and sabotaged by the Canada we do not want.